If anything in this article took you by surprise, you must have never had a job. Normally when I teach an in-person class, we have a competition to see who's had the worst jobs, and I think you all know a little bit of Barbara Ehrenreich's pain. I'm sure if you've ever worked in the food service industry, a lot of Barbara Ehrenreich's article probably rings very true to you. And if you've ever worked in a bad job, you can probably relate. Definitely I have. I mean, I know that there are worse jobs than what I have had. This doesn't look all that fun. But I've already told you the story of when they asked me to kill a rat with a broom handle that had a nail on the end of it. That was not a great job, and I've been challenging students to get me worse jobs than that, and the only one that's really come close was someone who worked in an Alzheimer's ward in a nursing home, which sounds fairly horrific. At any rate, this isn't the only job I've had that's had its negative times. My absolute first job was working as an asphalt pigmentation application specialist. What's that, you ask? Well, it's the people who paint lines on parking lots and streets and such. And what made this job so bad? Well, I had it in Florida in the summertime, where the temperature is regularly above 100. At least it was when I was there. It's been a while, so I'm sure that it probably gets even hotter nowadays. And sitting on freshly poured asphalt while you're working there, you can imagine some of the fun times I had. I'm really shocked I didn't pass out a lot more than I did. My biggest job growing up was I worked at Little Caesars Pizza for a very long time, and while there was a lot that was good about it, I was good at it, so I could do most of the work with my eyes closed. I did one time have an angry customer who jumped over the counter and threatened to knife me because his pizza was a little bit late. Yeah. Some people take this stuff really seriously. I had a job as a telemarketer. That was about as horrible as you can imagine. I sold bottled water. Yeah, I got people to pay me for something that comes out of their taps. It wasn't the best morally fulfilling job. I worked at a temp service agency for a while. That's where I did the famous rat killing job. And I worked in a whole lot of warehouses. You see pictures of warehouses online, and they're a lot cleaner than any warehouse I ever worked at. I tended to get filthy, because the places were relatively filthy. Next to the rat killing job, perhaps the worst job I had was also when I was with the temp service agency, and they sent me to a meat packing plant. Well, the meat packing plant wasn't like this. There wasn't lots of action going on because a few months before I worked there, they had an accident where someone was cleaning out an industrial meat grinder, and apparently the safety equipment didn't work as well as it should, and someone fell onto the on switch. I heard stories that it was as gruesome as you can humanly imagine. Anyway, since this accident, they had lost an awful lot of their business, and they were about to shut down. They hired me and some other temp service workers who were all ex-Navy guys, now that I think about it. And our job was to take all of the stock that was in the freezer, which was, if I recall, cases of spiced Mexican beef, load it onto pallets. My job was to paint over the 3 or 4 year old expiration dates, and then we loaded them onto a truck to take the stuff to a homeless shelter. It was a pretty bad job. Now, Ehrenreich goes on a lot about talking about bad jobs, and if you've ever had a job, I'm sure you've had bad components of it. And we could talk about why bad jobs are bad. You know, One of my observations was that managers in unimportant jobs were probably the biggest tyrants in the world because they knew they'd never, ever get any more power than they had. But let's set aside all that for a minute, because even if it was a great job from occupation standpoint, you know that there's going to be some big financial issues. Minimum wage was what most of these jobs started out at. They would not give you 40 hours a week because they would then have to give you benefits. So you'd work just a little under that. And the problem with working a little under that is that you never got enough money to actually survive. So you'd end up having to live as cheaply as humanly possible, or you would end up having to work multiple jobs. Now, we could go into a lot of reasons why this ended up being a self-fulfilling prophecy. You work at crap jobs, are you ever going to get out of it? But let's hit one or two really quickly. People who are less financially well off tend to have a radically higher amount of anger and stress. And the thing about stress is that stress has very specific results on the human body. Greater chance of depression, greater chance of lack of concentration, greater chance of high blood pressure, greater chance of eating issues, including changes in appetite which lead to weight gain, greater chance of a suppressed immune system leading to illness and higher levels of inflammation, so on and so forth. Stress is a very major deal, which means that if you're poor, you're going to be more stressed, and if you're more stressed, you're going to be sicker. But since you're not working a full-time job with great benefits, and the Affordable Care Act wasn't always around, and I think it's something we've touched on in the past, and you had to pay for your own health care, which led to lots of medical debt. This is one of the reasons why if you're poor, you're probably going to end up poor, because you're going to be in a job which has a lot of stress, and your lifestyle of trying to survive on not nearly enough money is going to lead to more stress, which means you're going to get sicker, and then if you have to go into the hospital, you're going to be in debt, and medical expense-related debt is not defined or given any specialized treatment in the bankruptcy code. So, you're going to be poor for a long time. It's not just the general levels of stress. One of the things that Ehrenreich talked about was how hard it was to eat healthy, because having a place to live that had proper food preparing appliances and having the tools that you needed to actually make food was expensive. So you ended up eating a lot of fast food. And what's bad with that is that junk food tends to be a lot more available and a lot more affordable than healthy food. People who are poor tend to eat a whole lot of starches and a whole lot of fats. And eating diets that are high in these things means that you're consuming extra calories. It means it screws up your insulin, which means it screws up your blood pressure and your blood sugar, and you're more likely to gain weight, and that means you're more likely to get sick, which means you're more likely to get into medical debt. We could fit a whole bunch of other factors in here and tie them back to how you're going to end up in increasing debt. Like housing. An average 2-bedroom rental unit housing wage, working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year in order to afford a fair market rent for a 2-bedroom rental unit without paying more than 30% of your income. In Ohio, it would take $14 an hour. Lots of jobs available at $14 an hour starting off. Hell, if you're in California, it would take $26.65 an hour to be able to afford a 2-bedroom house, and more if you're in some of the richer areas like San Francisco. You're pretty much going to be homeless unless you get a very, very good paying job. And we know what poverty does to people, right? We've talked about the stress and the bad food and all that. It's also in how you get to work. Public transportation tends to be heavier used by people who are living in poverty. And This is a problem because it tends to be supported by taxes, and the taxes tend to come from people who are not the people who are using public transportation. So is there a lot of incentive to fund public transportation in most places? Not really, so public transportation sucks. So it's harder to get to jobs, it's harder to look for jobs, which means it's harder to get into a better paying occupation, which means you're going to be stuck in your stressful job where you eat badly and live in a bad area town. Speaking of the bad area town, if you're living in a cheap place because you're broke, you're more likely to be the victims of crime. And if you get robbed, that's less money and you're going to be poorer. Not to mention that there's a higher chance of getting hurt in a crime, which would lead to medical debt. And if we want to get very happy-go-lucky about all of this, it's important to note poverty isn't distributed equally across our society. Some groups have a whole lot higher levels of poverty than others. African American households, the vast majority of them, I mean, look at the percentages. Over 38% in 2012, topped out at 37,000. That's not a lot. What they call this is the cycle of poverty. People who are poor, who have low family income, tend to have less access to food, safe water, health care, and school, which leads to hunger, poor sanitation, a worse education, which leads to fewer work opportunities, malnutrition, which means that the workforce in a poor area town is depleted and unskilled, and there's higher levels of unemployment, which leads to low family income, which yada, 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 so on, so forth. Now, if you've worked in a bad job, I'm not telling you anything you didn't already know. It's important to restate. Class mobility is directly tied to where you are in society. It's easier to become upper class if you're upper middle class than it is if you're a lower class person to become middle class. If you're a lower class person, your chances of upward mobility are much less than people higher in the food chain than you, and you're more likely to stay in the position that you are, which is something socially we should all know about. The other question, though, is we're in a writing class, so how does this apply to our writing? Well, I think the answer there is fairly simple. You look for the key takeaways in Barbara Ehrenreich's piece on how poverty seems to be a self-fulfilling and hardly survivable deal, and you look for real-world parallels. Now, her piece is nonfiction, but you look at the numbers, and that just kind of increases the case you can make. And this is a good example of taking claims from an article and examining them through the lens of more specific research, which is going to lead you to be able to make a much clearer argument about it. And that's what we're doing. When the first time I read Ehrenreich, it all hit home to me very tightly. I knew exactly everything she was talking about. I never dealt with it quite to the extent that she had, but I'd worked in fast food and in warehouses and other things long enough to know what the world was really like. So the point here isn't to go, yeah, things are bad. The point here is to use this as an example of how we need to work. We find evidence in Ehrenreich. We corroborate it with evidence that we have found about other things, the statistics about health care, about fast food healthiness and all that stuff. And the conclusion kind of builds out of it, doesn't it? So when you are able to use a lot of different sources, you can get a really different but full view of how the world works. And that's just going to yield better stuff. See you next time.